Welcome to Distrust and Disparities, Dismantling Black Health Disparities podcast. We examine health disparities that disproportionately affect Black women and Black families. In addition, we amplify organizations and individuals working to dismantle racist health practices and systems to improve health outcomes for marginalized communities. I'm your host, Jasmine Moore, a registered nurse, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Camille White.
Just because you have a Black person in leadership doesn't mean that they have experienced the psychological trauma of institutional racism in this country.
In this episode, we continue our interview with Dr. Jerome Lisk, an African-American dual board-certified neurologist with a subspecialty in movement disorders. Dr. Lisk discusses racial bias affecting African-American physicians and the difficulty of trying to get medical journals to publish articles addressing it.
Next, we want to talk about the article on racial bias. There's a large body of research on analyzing the problem and identifying health disparities. However, there is a lack of research or published research about the root causes of disparities, specifically racism. Medical and academic journals, typically they like to shy away from research that directly calls out racism at the root.
You mentioned, like, you along with other neurologists, about 9 or so, wrote an article on racial bias in medicine and that you're having difficulty with getting it published. And you said how the subject of the article is institutional racism against African-American physicians. And that's from, of course, like hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, medical organizations, and just other institutions in healthcare medicine. But can you just break down more and explain more about the article itself and then the difficulty that you all have faced in getting it published and sort of where you've attempted to get it published and maybe the responses you've gotten back from those journals?
Yeah, so the article is 10 action items to combat racial bias. And so this was basically, we chose this title because the women's group, and I can't remember the actual article that they published, but it was an article they published, and it was 10 action items to combat, I believe, sexism in medicine. And so it was responded to really well. I had the title correct, so excuse me, all my female neurologists out there that probably were involved with that, but I may not have that article, actually, the title correct, but it was basically the same concept. We said that got so much response and people really liked it, and they tend to be receptive to it. So let's do 10 action items to combat, not prevent, but to combat racial bias in medicine. And how this started is that someone sent an email. We have these little listservs with Neurology where all of us are on, certain email chains. And so someone sent an email, and I'm in my office in Pasadena, California, before I moved to Texas here, and I just had to respond. Something in me just had to respond because once again, we were looking at racial bias as the doctor-patient relationship, which is fine. And we have to help with diversity and inclusion and health equity with patients, people receiving healthcare. But as an African-American male physician and seeing other colleagues, people of color that are not African-American, Indian, Filipino, Hispanic, going through racial bias, whether you call it explicit or implicit racial bias in medicine, throughout our careers, from medical school to residency to when you're out with hospitals, pharmaceutical companies not giving you opportunities because they don't want you to be the face of their company. I just got so frustrated. I shot an email back, and I was in the zone as far as typing and my thoughts, and I got a response back that people were like, "Wow, really?" geez, I'm sorry you experienced that. I can't believe that that's still going on. And so a friend of mine he's an Indian physician that doesn't look quite Indian. He could be mistaken for Hispanic, or a mixture of Hispanic and African American. So he said, hey, Jerome, why don't we go ahead and do you want to do an article about this? I said, yeah, it'd be a great idea. So we basically got together, the two of us. We recruited physicians, and I had an African American physician in California working at USC Rancho Los Amigos in administration that basically said, yeah, I'll do it with you. And I said, great. I know this guy for a while, not personally, just colleague. Got off the phone and try to call him back next week so we could talk about it. Got no reply, and then talked to a couple other people. One guy's African American male said, well, it's not really, there's different ways to fight. I said, okay. And there was not a fear from African American neurologists that made excuses on why they didn't want to get involved in writing the article. And most of this is because of retaliation, getting ostracized, becoming a target. They don't want to be seen as that African American, that Black person that is talking about or complaining about racial bias, or that they're using that to say that their careers are not as advanced as they would like. So we went on and wrote it. Took a while. We started right after George Floyd. Right after George Floyd's murder, that's when we started it. We sent it to the Neurology journal. So there was a comment about it was too long and wanted us to trim it down. Then there was a comment saying that the subject was controversial. And well, of course it's controversial. That's why we're publishing it. Some authors didn't feel comfortable with it, right? They didn't feel comfortable, made them feel uncomfortable. Well, you have to have, there's a book over here that I have called Crucial Conversations. You have to have uncomfortable conversations in order to talk about and solve problems. We went to New England Journal of Medicine, they're publishing more stuff about diversity and inequality and health disparities than any journal in America. They turned us down more because it wasn't talking about patients, I believe, And then we even went to the American Journal of Psychiatry. They turned us down. We went to the Health Disparities Journal, even. You would think, how do I get turned down by the Health Disparities Journal? Okay, because we're not talking about health disparities with the public. We're talking about, how it affects African American physicians. And so finally, we went to Practical Neurology, and it's in review there. We went to Practical Neurology. They said, oh, it's too short. Can you give us the original version? So because we want to see the longer version of it. And we're like, and so there was a lot of attempts to get us to trim out things to, the last action item in the article was about grandfathering and board certification. There's a lot of money involved when it comes to board certification, millions and millions of dollars that these medical boards like the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology that they're making in addition to their day job that has been published, their salaries, their nonprofit salaries to have doctors do board certification that is meaningless and does not improve patient care. So that was mentioned in there as far as grandfathering, and that battle has been fought for a long time. And my co-author is, was even told, he was even told, if you continue down this path of fighting board certification, you're probably going to get blackballed in the American Academy of Neurology. And that's actually what happened. And so that could be, that's probably one of the other reasons why we didn't get published on those journals, is because we were talking about board certification and grandfathering. Because when the board certification was, when people grandfathered in, grandfathering means you don't have to take the test. It says, okay, if you left residency beyond this year, say 1980, say make up a year, 1985, then you're grandfathered in, you automatically are board certified. And you don't have to do the recertifications, right? Well,
things are changing all the time.
Who were what color were the physicians, and how many male physicians versus female physicians were there back in 1980s? Majority were Caucasian physicians, and majority were men and not women. So you've basically, that is kind of a form of discrimination when you talk about board certification, because now that the workforce is more diverse, you're making these people supposedly do these things that are supposed to make them more competent and keep their skills up.
Yeah.
But yet, the people that probably need to keep their skills up the most, the older physicians that didn't have all this new information and technology come out, now you're not requiring them to do it.
That's insane.
That's what really, I think that's probably one of the things that really hurt us the most.
But that's what needs attention called to.
Yes.
You need to be up to date on what's going on, and it affects your practice, and that's not fair. So that definitely needs to be spoken about.
Yeah, because it's doing a disservice to the other doctors who are then so-called, like you said, being forced to go through those recertifications to get this board certification. And then it's doing a disservice to the patients who are stuck with people who are just sort of like, oh, you got it way back when, so like you have it already. Like, how are their patients being treated versus these newer doctors? And you're grandfathering in a bunch of older white men for the most part, which then keeps these fields at a disadvantage in terms of the demographic and the makeup and who are in positions, who are doctors there serving communities. It's just, and I get why they don't want to change it, because that means confronting what they've done. And what they've done is made sure that white people, older white men, were protected in a way, and everyone else sort of has to try to catch up. But, and I can't believe, your other co-author ended up getting blacklisted, and the fear that you spoke about of other people that had initially said that they were interested or you thought would want to join in. And you have a fear of like, you've gotten to this level, you've been elevated to this point as a physician, and you've have your established career. And it is scary then to go against the mainstream. It's scary to then confront these controversial topics that they talk about, because then what you've made and established is in jeopardy. But realistically, you need to look at the bigger and broader picture of what about everybody else that'll come after you? What about all the other people that like you could be helping? And it's hard to do that, but then we need to understand that in coming together and being supportive of our community members is really how we can affect change, and not existing on like our own little islands of like, you got to protect with what's yours, and understanding that maybe what's yours can also be what other people have too.
Yeah. In our article, it goes over the 10 action. The first action item is be aware of your implicit bias towards others. And so there's conscious bias, which are stereotypes or preconceived notions that we're fully aware of. You know, that could be people calling you racial slurs out, you know, the Ku Klux Klan rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, that's more conscious bias. Unconscious or implicit bias are, you know, stereotypes or preconceived notions that subconsciously influence our thoughts or actions. So you have these pervasive, distinct mental constructs that may not necessarily align with the people's principles of belief, or the principles, or the person's harboring them. In the book called The Blind Spot from Harvard University goes into this, and there's a lot of psychological research. That book is packed with research with age discrimination, gender discrimination and racial discrimination, and it stresses that good people have biases, right? You have a bias about what grocery store you go to when you want to go someplace. You have a bias on whether you like dogs or cats. To Black folks, we feel as if, okay, when people are doing something that we know is prejudice, and we can recognize it better than any other group, because you've been around it so long and you experience. Other people don't recognize it because they haven't experienced it. They don't have their antennas up, right? Well, majority of racial bias is implicit. People, it's unconscious. And when you point that, but to us, we feel implicit bias is conscious bias. And this is where where things go south. A white person says something to a Black person, clearly, racial. It's prejudicial, and you tell the person, well, you're being racist or you're being prejudiced. That white person says, I'm not racist, I'm not prejudiced. And so people get defensive. Good people have biases. You could be a good person and have racial bias.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a bad person.
No, you're not a bad person, but it's about in the moment when you're confronted with someone telling you, hey, that behavior, that action, what you just said, there's an issue with it. And instead of maybe receiving that and going, ooh, let me reevaluate how I'm approaching things, a lot of people get defensive, like you said, and then automatically sort of shut down. And there needs to be an open-mindedness and a willingness to understand from other people's perspectives where I'm telling you this because this makes me feel uncomfortable. And you need to understand that the way society has been structured and built, especially in this country, is that you've always been comfortable. Now is your time to be uncomfortable and to realize that the things that you're doing are harmful to me. And they might seem like little tiny moments, but that all builds up to a bigger and broader issue. And so we need to realize that, and hopefully people can be more open-minded and accepting of when their racial bias is called out. But like you've shown with this paper, people really aren't willing to do that because there's so much hesitance and then they don't want to publish it. So...
Well, also what happens is, I want people that if they're not a person of color, if a person of color tells you you're being racist or prejudiced, first ask that person, well, are you saying what I'm doing, was what I did or what I said was prejudice? And don't internalize it. People internalize it and they say, well, you're saying I am prejudiced, I am racist. No, even the person is saying what they really mean is what you did or what you said. So do not internalize it and actually have a conversation about it, because you're probably a good person and they probably really don't think that you're really racist. They think you just did a racist thing. And that's separate from you as a person or human being. We're not saying that's who you are.
There needs to be more articles discussing this, and people need to be having study groups and just breaking it down. Like, what can you do? How can you address your biases? Like you said, we all have some inherent biases. So what can we do so that we can make our practice equitable and things? And we can't just all say, oh, we're just going to be colorblind. We're just going to be colorblind, because it does not work like that. And that does not improve health outcomes for anyone. And like you said, I can't wait for the article to come out. It's 10 actionable steps. A lot of times we want to research it and identify the health disparity in this. But what can we do? We need to take these action steps, apply them, and see how they are improving outcomes. Like, we need to be putting things into practical, actionable steps. And you shouldn't be receiving pushback. We should be open to having this dialogue in order to move the conversation forward. And I wanted to talk. It can be difficult when you're trying to speak up, you're trying to address racial biases within your field. And I know you're in school currently pursuing an executive healthcare MS MBA combination degree. And we just want to talk about like your future plans with that, because it can be hard, climbing the corporate ladder and getting into the C-suite of healthcare, where you can really make large scale systemic approaches. But like how you said, your friend who is speaking out and he's being blackballed and blacklisted. So I just want to know how you plan to address those barriers and what you're doing with your furthering your education.
What I want to do is get into a technology or artificial intelligence company. Some company deals with technology and healthcare.
Okay.
And I know I'm going to have to be pretty close to the top of the ladder to really influence the culture and to really, make sure that we're doing the best that in any company that I join, that we're doing the best that we can do for diversity and making everyone feel that they could be proud to show their culture, whether it's a hairstyle, whether it's the way they dress, whether it's anything about their culture. They could come into that organization and not feel judged. That's one of our action items as well, is not assimilating as well. How they say, you have to act white, and we have these examples like, Clarence Thomas, Brian Gumble, people used to make jokes about that in the past. And it's important to know, as I bring that up, that just because you have a Black person in leadership doesn't mean that they have experienced the psychological trauma of institutional racism in this country. There are Black people from Africa. There are Black people from the Caribbean, Cuba, Brazil. I was in college with a Black girl from France that couldn't hardly speak a lick of English. And so just because you put Black people there doesn't mean that they're African Americans that have gone through this experience and that these other Black people can relate to African Americans.
If you are enjoying this episode, you should consider buying us a coffee. Yes, a coffee. That small gesture will help us continue to create quality episodes and content. Click the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes or check out our website at distrustanddisparities.com.
I was in the American Academy of Neurology 2016 Diversity Leadership Program because I had tried from 2009 to 2016 to get on a committee and kept on getting denied. So finally, I just said, I quit. I'm not going to become a member anymore. Fill out a survey saying all this. I felt like, African Americans and women were not necessarily being allowed to seek leadership positions. And so they sent me, CEO called me. I did that on a Friday. CEO called me on a Monday and said, don't quit. We need people like you, et cetera. So they got me in. And the first day I mentioned that there was nothing in our bylaws to show how we treat each other. There is now, but how we treat each other. And in that diversity leadership program, we had 12 to 13 people. Why are there only 2 African Americans in the whole program? But the program is geared towards people that grow up in the United States that have been disenfranchised with institutional racism to allow more people of color, particularly people that are at a disadvantage and are not learning about this in high school and college, getting this exposure. Mm-hmm. So instead, they filled it with people that were either first or second generation African. And when they didn't fill Hispanic Americans, they got people that were first generation here from Venezuela, Colombia. So they're seeking minorities that are either their first time here or that they're first generation, but they're not putting the minorities that are grown up here, that are experiencing generational racial bias. They're not putting those people in the programs, but it looks good because when you look at people, you can't tell who's African American and who's not.
Yeah, very true.
So that's a big problem with diversity programs in the United States.
Okay. Yeah.
And also leadership roles too.
Yeah.
They're not putting African Americans in leadership roles, just Black people.
Yeah, we really need to unpack that because as Black people, we are not a monolith. We all have different complexities, and it's very different from people, generations of people who have grown up, descendants of slaves will have a different perspective versus somebody who comes here, first generation here. So it's very different cultural beliefs and ideologies. So we can't just, put someone in a position like you said, race is a social construct. So that needs to be broken down as well. So.
Right. And even when you have African Americans that you put in a leadership position, it doesn't mean that those African Americans are going to care about diversity.
Yeah.
So not only do you first of all have to get African Americans there so that you are helping other African Americans that are generations that are descendants of slaves and have experienced generational racism, but then you got to get those people that have a passion about it. I've seen we have African American leaders in medical organizations I'm a part of that they kind of sit there and they're kind of just kind of passive, and they do little things here and there. They'll speak up if things get out of control, but they're not progressive.
Yeah,
and that's a problem. And when you're 5'5" as an African American male, and you look like a little teddy bear, versus you look like me, you're 6'2", 235, and the first that you walk in the room, the first thing people think is you played basketball or football. And that's the first conversation they want to have with you. You're not the type of African American they're trying to put in the leadership position that they feel looks smart enough, that has that intellectual look. And so I get a lot of that too. Not only African American, but if you have somebody 6'5" that looks like a WWE wrestler or bodybuilder coming in, you're not going to automatically think this guy's the smartest guy in the room. Right? Yeah. But he may be. He probably is. And so size, your athletic build, that could be intimidating to people. And that even adds in more bias.
Yeah. And you make a lot of great points, and we definitely need to put a pin in this conversation, and we can't wait until this article comes out so that we can fully break down all those actionable steps. And between your practice, also being an adjunct clinical faculty member, team member, and also the research, we want to know, what do you like to do for fun in like your downtime? How do you relax? It can be hard, like tackling like racial disparity. Yes. So how do you keep yourself renewed and just going into things optimistically?
So I spend a lot of time at home with my family, like spending time with my wife, et cetera, doing things with her. Also, I like playing chess. I don't get to play very often, but we all have those little games we play on our iPad or on our phone. I have one of those little ones that I'm playing all the time. Going to the shooting range, and in the recent past, jiu-jitsu, because jiu-jitsu is like chess.
Oh, okay.
And so jiu-jitsu is something that I need to get back into. But, working out, lifting weights, things of that sort, like doing that type of thing.
Nice. Yeah, well-rounded. And I know you were talking before about the blind spot. Any other books or podcasts that you would recommend to our audience to check out? It could be healthcare related or just anything that you've been listening to.
Yeah, Ion Healthcare. It's ION Healthcare. There's a guy named KP. I met him on LinkedIn, and we built a relationship. He's big in diversity and inclusion. And he has a lot of people that are on his show that are talking about healthcare disparities. But once again, no, we don't want to hold the mirror up to ourselves. Mm-hmm. He does. He's also recognized this as a problem. But whenever we have guests on podcasts and radio shows or even TV, we're always talking about, as it relates to the patient, as if Black folks are just kind of going through medicine and this is the only field that has no racism, and we're just happy and cheesing and having a good time, which is not really the case. And so that's one. I recommend everyone to take the implicit bias test at Harvard EDU. All you have to do is put implicit bias test Harvard into Google and take that. And if you Google blind spot, don't put the blind spot because you'll get a different book, but definitely read Blind Spot on audiobooks. Very good book. There's also a book, probably one of the first books to talk about health disparities, by W.B. Du Bois, The Philadelphia Negro. That's another book that talked about health disparities too.
Those are great recommendations, and I'm sure our audience would love to check those out.
Thank you for coming on our show, and we look forward to having you back because I learned so much, and I know Camille learned so much.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me, guys, and I appreciate you and all the great work you're doing with this podcast. This podcast is needed. And when you ask the things we need to do, well, podcasts like these is one of them. We need to talk about it. And so that's one of the first steps, is talking about it, and talking about it makes people feel more comfortable.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you would like to suggest a topic we should discuss or share your own personal story, email us at distrustanddisparities@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate, review, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Distrust and Disparities, and on Twitter at DistrustPod.